suggestions are welcome. We're making this our classroom, so we now have a sort of a home, and any suggestions about aesthetics or whatever. Everybody can hear me okay? Yeah, okay. And you can see okay? Okay. So what we're going to do today is catch up on a little bit about what we didn't talk about in terms of mutuality and Buber, just for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to start what's known as family therapy in earnest, and that will feel very different. But first of all, I just want to catch you up on a few things that we didn't talk about last time. See, Buber was writing in 1923. That's a long time ago, and there was no such thing as brain science. And he had an intuition based on his own experiences, some of which were tragic. And these days, when we look at Buber, when actually brain scientists look at Buber, they see that there was a sort of intuition that has gained some scientific basis, actually an important scientific basis, and that has to do with mirror neurons. So for those of you who remember what the brain looks like, here it is. This is the front, this is the back, this is the bottom. And the back of the front is what's called the motor cortex. The back of the front is where our muscles are mapped on the brain. And when you want to raise your hand, there's a particular place here, which is the map of your hand, and that sends a signal and your hand gets raised. And when you put something in your hand and you sense something, right across the street is what's called the sulcus, or a crease. You see the brain is all creased. So there's this crease, a major one here, and right across the street from where the hand is executing something, that's where the hand is feeling something. So the brain is mapped, doing things, feeling things, one across the other, but it was absolutely crucial until 1996 that everybody knew that the front does things and the back senses things. In 1996, an experiment went awry in Parma in Italy, and what happened was that there was this monkey, and you put the small electric cable in his brain, and they wanted to see there's a place for every muscle, but what about complex movements? So they put a lead into here, right at the back of the motor, where it does it. So okay, monkey, give him put a banana in front of him. The monkey does a complex, meaningful action. He reaches for a banana, and there it was. And there was a place in the motor cortex in the front where it's supposed to be, and that was fine. So we now are going to get our doctorate or get our publication. The thing went off the right way. And when the thing goes off, it makes a noise, and then you know that particular place where that little electrical cord is, that is going off. So they took a break, and during the break, one of the assistants was hungry, so he reached his arm out to take an orange. And when he reached his arm out to take an orange, the monkey, who wasn't doing anything, the monkey's brain went, It wasn't supposed to do that. This is in the front, where you do things. The monkey wasn't doing something, the assistant was doing something. But it was the same kind of movement, which was meaningful, and the monkey's brain went off as if the monkey was reaching for something. So if this had happened in Los Angeles, the assistant would have been fired. If it happened in New York, the assistant would have been murdered. But it was happened in Parma in Italy. But people have a sense of humor, and they were drinking some wine and eating some pasta, and they said, "Ha! This is a strange monkey. Let's see what happens." So they went ahead and did all sorts of things, and meaningful things in front of the monkey, and the monkey was acting as if it had what we now call a mirror neuron. In other words, when I reach for an orange, the monkey's brain experiences itself as reaching for something. Now that crosses boundaries, it's supposed to be that this is my brain and this is your brain. That's not supposed to happen. If the monkey sees something, he's supposed to see it in the back, not in the front. So it seemed as if we have neurons that mirror actions that are meaningful. Is that what you follow it? So since 1996, people have been working on this for the last more than 20 years. And what comes out is that if there's an intentional or meaningful activity, that the person seeing the meaningful activity feels as if I'm doing the activity. It feels as if it's mine. You see where this gets to Buber? Just imagine where it's getting to Buber. So with human beings, then we sort of dance together. In other words, the boundaries are not as clear. They're biologically not as clear as we thought. And that from the beginning, if I see somebody, people who watch soccer, you know, and there's a kick and there's a goal. If you look at the brains of all the men who are watching that goal, their brain feels like they kicked the goal. Otherwise, what's the interest? Somebody else kicked the goal. It feels like you've kicked the goal. And if there's a smile that comes to your face, you see those are muscles that create a smile. It's a complex, meaningful activity. And so when somebody smiles at you, you actually feel that you're smiling. Huh? And if somebody is looking at you in an angry way, that's probably where shame comes about, because it feels like you're angry with yourself. In other words, your own face seems to be doing what you're seeing from the other side. Now that solved, for example, a mystery which mystified mothers, fathers, and Piaget. Mothers, fathers, Melo, and Piaget, you know, he said, this one I can't solve, which is, how is it that at a couple of months, if you stick out your tongue, everybody's done it, right? You stick out your tongue at a baby, and the baby sticks out his tongue. Now, that baby cannot possibly know in a cognitive way that the pink thing that's coming out of somebody else's face is the same as his tongue. And not only that, but you can measure how long it would take to go, we go back to the brain, you see, let's say I stick out my tongue. So the baby has to see that, that's over here. And then the baby has to experience it, and then has to think about it up here. There's a certain time that it would take to say, oh, that's a tongue, I'm going to stick out my tongue. There's no delay. The baby's tongue comes out as if that's my tongue that's being stuck out at me. So in other words, when you stick out your tongue at the baby, the mirror neuron in the baby's brain says that's my tongue. And then the tongue comes out, right? So that we're hardwired to reciprocate with each other and to experience the other as part of my own experience. That's not a confusion of boundaries. That's how human beings are made. That's how mammals are made. Now, all the things I told you about in terms of communication in the face, that hasn't yet been proven. So take it at face value, but it will be, I think, at some point. It's just difficult experiments. Yeah, someone.
Has there been research done with these mirror neurons and someone with sociopathic tendencies?
With what?
Someone who has like sociopathic tendencies. Like, has there been any research done?
Right. So Zalma is suggesting what he's going to write his doctorate about, which is what if you find people whose mirror neurons are awry? Is it possible that some of psychopathology is connected with mirror neurons that have a delay? There were early studies in the 60s and 70s of autistic children. Once you could video them, you could see that there's a delay in their responses. That was way before mirror neurons. I don't know if that's been repeated, but those are the kinds of thoughts that will help you to think when you're sitting in a room with a client and they're looking at your face, and you say to yourself, what's going on in my face is going on in their face, what's going on in their face is going on in my face, then you'll understand why Sigmund Freud, when he was asked, why do you sit behind your clients and have them lie on a couch, his answer was, I can't tolerate people looking at my face all day. He had a sort of intuition that it's the kind of communication that was confusing to him, and that he wanted to be able to think, because that's how the kind of research that he was doing. So that's, yeah.
This mirror neuron makes the person do the same action or feel as if he's doing the same action?
Both. In other words, if the baby has no delay, the baby will stick out his tongue because he feels his tongue is already out, right? But when you watch the goal, hopefully you don't kick something in the living room at the same time. But you feel like you're doing it.
Why don't you actually do that?
Why don't you do it? Because you're a complex human being that does more than just respond immediately. In other words,
You should have the feeling inside you to do it?
yeah. In other words, there'll be a feeling inside. Let me give you an example. See, here's the front of the bus. That's the front, and here's the back, right? Front, back. So when you watch dancing, they took capoeira dancers, and they watched classical ballet. It only happened, whatever happened only in the back. They were watching it. But when they showed them capoeira dances, which was meaningful to them, then not only did they experience it in the back, but they danced in the front. And the same with classical ballet. When they watched ballet, they felt that they were dancing. Their front motor neurons were being ignited. So it's not that you're not seeing it, you're also seeing it, but you're also feeling as if you're doing it. Yeah.
I'm wondering if this is what happens to the brain when you're dreaming at night?
What's that?
When someone's dreaming at night, when you have a dream,
Right.
is your brain functioning that way as well?
Oh, for
Your
sure.
body is stopping you from actually acting on it?
When you dream, the question is, what about dreaming? You can all hear the questions, right? I mean, we have decent acoustics here. So when you're dreaming, what happens is that the motor cortex is shut down. There's an inhibition of the motor cortex in dreaming. And so all these things happen, but you don't do them. That's what allows a person to dream all kinds of horrible things or pleasant things and not actually do them. But you do see some kind of elements of movement. It wouldn't be a mirror neuron because you're not seeing somebody else doing it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so, you've all seen, here's a child and his father with shaving cream. And you can see that the facial expression is being mirrored literally. And the same when people just talk. These are two assistants in the lab who discovered the mirror neurons discussing it. You can see that they're not exactly von unseres, but that's how they look at it. Now, the other thing that's important to know is that there's an element of timing. When Buber spoke about the moment, so what kind of a moment do you imagine? Do you imagine a very fleeting moment? Do you imagine something a little longer? It turns out that in brain science we can also time consciousness. Consciousness does not take place immediately. In other words, if something goes by us at less than 100th of a second, it didn't get in. You need 100th of a second for what you're seeing to get in. 100th of a second is pretty short, but it doesn't get in if it flashes right by like that.
So I'm not totally getting it. Let's say a father's doing something with a child.
Say that again.
I'm not totally getting it. If a father's doing something with a child, does it also, it's because the child copying the father, or the child thinks what his father's doing?
The child feels that what the father's doing, he's doing.
So why is it not a meshment?
Why what?
So why is this not a meshment?
Why is it not? I couldn't hear you.
Why is it not like a boundary issue?
Why the boundary is not what we thought it was. In other words, up until mirror neurons, we were sure that the child would see the father doing something. He would register it in the back of his brain where you see things. He would then think about it and say, oh, that's my father who's doing it, it's not me. Right? But it turns out not to be the case, that there's a sense in which you also do that, but you also experience as if it's partly you.
So that's a healthy, normal interaction?
That's a healthy, normal interaction which goes on lifelong. Right? In other words, it's something that we're never free of. It goes on when you're looking into the face of your client or your spouse. It's going on all the time. Those sorts of things are going on. And that makes human life more interesting and a little bit more complex than we thought, because the notion that human beings are separate from each other and that you always know what the boundary is not really true, it turns out. Mystics in the East knew that a long time ago. But in the West, we were sure that the individual is only an individual. It turns out we're less of a completely only individual than we thought.
So is this like the same thing as like my own opinion? Like,
that's right. So,
in the healthy version, I'm saying?
that's right. Exactly. In other
Like
words,
it's like a certain connection action that you're both sharing.
Exactly. In other
It
words,
doesn't, it doesn't always mean you know what's going on in another person's head or.
oh, so do you know what's going on in the other person's head? There's a certain danger, isn't there? Because if the person smiles at you, and it feels like it's your smile, so you can sort of connect your smile with what makes you smile. But that may not be what's making them smile. So then you have to work on it to try to understand it. But there's an immediate connection that takes place that then needs figuring out. But if you think about the I-thou moment that Buddha was talking about, that connects with the fact that there's something that passes between people that's experienced as not so much of a boundary, right? Something like a co-creation.
I'm wondering, does it stay in memory as well? Like, if you get somebody 20 years later that thinks that they go on completely.
Just one second. Come in, make the noise that you need to make, and then we'll. As you can see where the pizza is. So, okay. I'm trying to remember all of your names now. I have your pictures, but you don't look like your pictures. So your name is.
Beta.
You really don't look like your picture. Okay. Yeah, Bela.
Does the experience stay in the person's memory as well as if they actually, could it stay in the person's memory as well as if they actually experience the experience that they watch?
I don't follow what you're asking about memory.
So the experience that goes on in the brain,
Yeah.
does it stay in the, is it going to become a memory for them? Is it a memory that they experience even though it's something that they watch?
Yes. The question was, well, let's say your mirror neurons go on and somebody's smiling and you also feel that your smile is there, right? The truth is that, as you know, you're likely to smile, right? So if you're inhibiting your smile, you remember that. If the smile lights up, you'll remember your own smile. You may not remember where it comes from. You may not remember that it was ignited as a mirror neuron. That's where the boundary problem comes up. That babies don't always know, is it me or is it mother, right? And the point is that they shouldn't know. And there's something about that that continues lifelong. It's not psychopathology. It's, as Zalma was suggesting, maybe not having that is more like psychopathology. But it needs working out because you don't want to be sure that the other person is you. The idea of IU is that there's two individuals who do something together. They don't stop being individuals, but they stop thinking about being individuals while they're doing it. Question?
Is it a physical mirroring? That means the person doing a physical action that I feel like I'm doing? Or is it a meaning-making type of mirroring, which means I see a person smiling?
No, it's before meaning. In other words, the feeling that you kick the goal, it's quick. It happens immediately. It feels like your leg kicked the goal.
So technically, the person kicking the goal gets a tremendous feeling of excitement of kicking the goal. It means, let's say I would have known.
You ever go to a soccer game?
No,
That's crazy, right?
But let's say I don't know what soccer is,
Right.
and I see someone kicking the goal. I'll just feel like I'm kicking a ball. It won't be a kicking a soccer.
See, that's where mirror neurons work in complex activities that are meaningful. If they're not meaningful, it doesn't work. Now, what does that mean, meaningful? That's an interesting question. Where is the meaning system set up in the brain so that when capoeira dancers watch capoeira, they're set to see it as meaningful, but classical ballet doesn't work for them.
So it's not just a physical mirroring. If you need it to be meaningful, it has to be.
There has to be something that's a complex and meaningful motion. In other words, it's already meaningful to me. It means something to me. Some things are set up automatically, like face, I think, is set up automatically. There's face recognition automatically. But other things are cultural. In other words, put it this way. If in Italy you did this to the monkey, likely it was the monkey would not even ask a klotzkasha. He wouldn't, because that's not a meaningful movement. But if I do it here, all the men are going to be wondering what the point is. So there are cultural things. Now, how that works, we don't know.
So now let's say it's meaningful for you, but not for me. Which means I'm doing the action
Right.
that's not meaningful.
Right.
Let's say the monkey is doing like this, and
Okay.
you're watching the monkey do like that.
Right.
So will you feel like you're doing it because for you it's meaningful?
It's a good question, but I don't know. You know, that we're getting from, you see, what you're doing is you're treating something that's empirical as if it's axiologic, and it's not. It's empirical, so there's some facts and there's some things that aren't facts. You're trying to say, how should it be? If you were back, we don't know.
Okay, but.
We're still collecting
But
data.
I'm not asking like this because you went like this and I felt like I have to ask a
Right.
question, but because when you're treating a client and you're using this kind of insight, so if you're just gonna make it,
Yeah,
I understand, it's like yellow medicine.
right. So, you all have projects for your for your first doctorate, your second doctorate. In other words, this is an area that's, let's put it this way, it was discovered by accident, like a lot of good things were discovered. Nobody thought this was possible. How to make these facts come all together is too complex for current methods, so a lot of questions are there. So that's great, we have a lot of questions and things to work out. Yeah,
The meaningful factor was part of this, what they discovered? That only meaningful...
yes, right. In other words, reaching for food was a meaningful activity. If it was like that, probably the monkey wouldn't have responded. It's because the assistant was hungry. Yeah.
Two things. First of all, why was there an assumption immediately that because the motor area of the brain fired off, that means that it was an experience for the monkey as if it did that action, as opposed to like redefining that area of the brain a little bit, as not just purely a motor area.
Okay, so Zal was asking, where'd the assumption come from that it's only motor? And the answer is from some facts that were seen and some facts that were not seen. That's how it is in science, that what you're looking for, you find, and what you're not looking for, unless you're partly drunk and satisfied with pasta, you don't see it, right? You need a sense of humor when something happens that's out of the box to say, wait a minute, maybe the box isn't the way it is. So, the brain was mapped in the late 19th and early 20th century, the very primitive, from our point of view, no computers, no way of computing complex things. So it was mapped in a very simple way, and it was simpler to do it that way. But a lot of assumptions that we have about human beings come from primitive methods, and they get changed as we look further. One second, yeah.
So is it possible?
Now, which picture don't you look like? What's your name?
Yuhadis.
What?
Yuhadis.
Say it again?
Yuhadis.
Yeah.
That's not on it.
I'll find you somewhere.
Um,
Go ahead.
so,
Yeah.
so my question was similar, like if
Yeah.
it's based on primitive, like the science for the research, it doesn't sound like it makes sense. Like, because you're smiling, so maybe my brain by now is excited that you're smiling. Doesn't sound like it makes sense, like, because you're smiling, so really I feel like I'm smiling.
What?
Like, the whole notion to me, like, once you get older, it doesn't sound like it makes so much
Okay.
sense. And you said it's based on primitive research, so who said the whole thing about, like, you're smiling because I think I'm smiling?
I think you discovered that you're Yehudis.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happens as time goes on? We don't know. In other words, we don't have the tools yet to be able to say, well, a one-year-old child is this way with the mirror neurons, and what happens at 5, and what happens at 10. That's your doctorate. That's something that's interesting to study developmentally. And what happens when you're raising small children? What happens when you're raising bigger children? What happens when you're with grandchildren? Those are all very interesting things. They're too complex for the current methods that we
It's
have.
all like super subconscious that when you smile, I feel like I'm smiling. Like, really,
Yeah, it's subconscious.
it doesn't even feel like.
But it feels like a connection. In other words, when, let's say you're old like me and you have grandchildren, and they smile at you, well, something happens to you.
So maybe it triggers you to want to smile back, but it doesn't mean that was my smile.
The mirror neuron says that was my smile. In other words, there's a connect. Now, there's a few things in the brain. You see, the brain has a few things. There's a few things other than mirror neurons, right? Particularly, it has this whole big lump over here where we think. That's called the prefrontal cortex. And the way we think about the brain now is not about this point or that point, but we think about communication between the points. All of brain science is moved from anatomy to essentially energy, to forms of communication. So when I have this feeling, I do some stuff with it, which is connected to memories, it's connected to other feelings, and it's connected to, every now now and then to thinking. It happens from time to time, even with grandchildren. But but there's something there that's still there. Now, the mirror neurons don't go away. Like everything that's simple in the brain, it then becomes integrated into something that's complex. And so the relationship with a person, there's an element of it that's simpler and more direct than we thought, and that becomes integrated. And we try to think about what we do with it. So if you think about it, you could say, well, maybe if I am not busy disconnecting from people, busy saying, oh, whose smile was that, which is an I-it kind of thought, and allow that to be the gate to an entry into an I-thou experience of a direct connection, then instead of fighting against it, I can allow it to bring me to something that's very, very meaningful. It doesn't mean that I stopped existing or that I become him, with two different people, but there's a co-creation that the mirror neurons are part of what enables it. It's not all of it.
So that makes more sense, that it's like the conduit, but not that it is actually me.
But this is making an important point. Whenever you talk about something concrete and simple, you have to remember that it's concrete and simple, but I'm not concrete and simple, right? In other words, that you have this finding, and then you say, well, so what? And the answer to so what, so what is a very deep question in science. Aristotle started to ask it, and since then we've been asking it. So what? So is it there? Yes. Is it there by itself and not integrated? No. So that's where the fun begins. Where does it fit? What does it do? What does it not do? Where does it scare people? Where does it enlighten people? Where does it allow people to be connected without being conscious, and so forth? Yeah, so those are all very good questions. Sheila?
Is this the backing, the biological backing of transference, countertransference, and projective identification?
So the question is this the biological background for transference? As you know, transference was discovered by Freud in, anybody remember the year? There's a year, it's the Dora case. The 17-year-old started to drive him nuts, and he tried to explain it to her until he realized that there was a drama happening in the room. And that was in 1905. And since then, therapists have realized that there's a drama going on in the room, which is not about what happened elsewhere, it's also being recreated here. Now, is the mirror neuron, if we take Yudis' question seriously, is the mirror neuron part of it? Apparently, yes. And apparently, that's why Freud was trying to not have face-to-face contact, so the mirror neurons could rest and not contaminate what's happening in the room. But he realized it didn't help, right? But is it part of what happens face-to-face when when you have a quizzical look on your face, which hopefully is like 90% of the time because you really don't know what's going on, so you're interested in but the patient who you're talking to has seen other quizzical looks, haven't they? And some of those quizzical looks may have been intrusive or controlling or seductive. And so I'm just trying to listen, the therapist says. And the client says, just like my father was trying to listen, right? So it'll get mixed in there. Is it the only thing that goes on in transference? No, because transference is a whole set of relationships that are brought into the drama of the room in therapy. So, but it's part
I
of
guess
it.
more my question was in projective identification, when we're having the subconscious feeling, are the mirror neurons involved in that because you feel it, but it's not your own, it's somebody else's, it's a response.
Right. Projective identification is a term that who's so familiar with it that they want to volunteer to explain it? Nobody. Okay. So projective identification is not a term that was used by Freud. It was used by Melanie Klein. And Melanie Klein was the first person who realized that the boundaries were not so clear. And that was also a perception of her own. It was probably based in a severe psychopathology, but also brilliance. And projective identification is something that has to happen. It's a drama. In other words, when I think that you're looking at me because you hate me, and it's only in my head, that's projection. Nothing's happened to you. I just had this crazy idea that you hate me, and I won't tell you why I thought that, but and so I project it onto you. But if I annoy you until you hate me, then that's projective identification. Projective identification has to work. It has to get the other person to do something. So obviously, when that happens in the room all the time, and we're always managing it, is the mirror neuron one of the mechanisms that projective identification works? Probably, right? It would make sense that it would be, right? And if you weren't aware that you were thinking that my face is your face, so it would work pretty well. Okay, so let me just tell you one more point, is then we want to get to family therapy. The final point is that the brain needs time. And this is important for therapists who sometimes are the first people who just wait, who give a little bit of time. If it's less than 100th of a second, nothing gets in. To have a complex response, you need about 1/4 of a second. 1/4 of a second, something actually happens. But to have an experience of consciousness of something happen, you need to what's called re-enter. In other words, all the sections of the brain need to connect with each other. They flow from one to the other. You have a response, let's say, in the motor neuron. That makes you a little nauseous, so that's another part of the brain. That makes you a little scared, which is another part of the brain. And then you think about it and say, what's happening to me? And that's another part of the brain. And so the flow, you can actually compute how long the brain needs in order to have a moment that you're conscious of. And that happens to be between 3 and 10 seconds. Moments of consciousness are not immediate. And if you think about poetry, it's a line of poetry. Poetry is organized. Actually, most of speech is organized. Actually, Kriyas Torah is organized. When it's not, it's usually a couple of seconds. And there's certain play between the beginning and the end of a pasuk that you'll see that the time is crucial. If you look at, I have to reach Shvi this week, so I'm busy with that, but you'll see that there's a beginning of a pasuk and then a short end, and a short beginning and then a long end. There's a play of time that has to do with consciousness. What is being called for in consciousness? It takes some time. So the fact that consciousness needs this re-entry, that's another way of thinking about the I-thou moments. They don't zing by you. They don't happen in 1/4 of a second. They need a couple of seconds. They need a line of poetry. They need something that happens in the room that takes a certain amount of time. And that's an intuition, but it turns out that it's based in brain science. So let me just, and those of you who do video editing will find that there's a general assumption that you put something up for not less than 3 seconds. And that's done by people who know nothing about this, but that's a sort of a general assumption that something that you want to make conscious, you leave it up there for 3 seconds or 4 seconds. If you want it to zing by and confuse and dance in a different way, you do less than 3 seconds, and then it's a completely different experience of consciousness. So let me just end this part of it with this statue. This is, you can see it, it's a statue of 2 figures, a male and a female one. I've been criticized for the fact that the male is bigger than the female. It's not my statue, but it's a statue called Multiform by a Moroccan and French sculptor in Tzfat named Jonathan Darmon, who allowed me to take these pictures of it on the condition, since I was there wearing a yarmulke, he said, I try to sell this statue to firm people, but they appeal to it, but they say, what's the source? And I don't have a source. If you have a source, you can take the pictures. So I'll tell you about the source in a minute. But you see, this is a statue of 2 figures, and they seem to be deeply involved. You could say it's like an I-thou moment. Each is fully engaged in himself, and they're engaged with each other. Look. This is a statue that he sells to blind people because they can feel the movement. It's the same statue. It dances, right? And so you can say, well, what's an I-thou moment? It's a moment. It's 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and then you go back out to I-it. Some of you in the blog, we have a very interesting blog for those of you who haven't read it yet about the I-thou moment. You go to an I-it moment where you're separate. You're thinking about things somebody wrote about. Maybe you're talking about what just happened, but you're talking about it. Talking about it, it might happen again, right? And so experience is punctuated, and I think this is a way of looking at what Buber uses. Buber used a linguistic metaphor. This would be a spatial metaphor, where we dance with our clients. That there are moments like this, but not all the moments. And then if the moments between allow it to happen again, then something's going on. What's the source? Not everybody will like this source. Some people like it, some people don't. But,
Yes.
what's that?
Can I have a guess?
Say what?
Can I have a guess? Can I have a guess?
You do. That. Of course you can have a guess.
Like the Kruvim.
The Kruvim, okay. So the Kruvim are Ellen Ba'alma, and in Baba Tzadik Tet, we have a discussion of the Kruvim, and now the Kruvim, that's the Kodesh HaKodeshim, right? And the Kruvim is only in the first Mikdash, and that's a special moment. But the Shekhinah is supposed to be between the Kruvim, right? And the idea is that it's a metaphor of Kadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael. Knesset Yisrael is always the female figure. And there's a machloket about how they were positioned. Because in Shemot it says they're face to face. And in Divrei HaYamim it says that Nehem Labayit, they're facing the back wall. And Shlomo HaMelech was Chacham Mikol Adam, he didn't say. Right? So when he builds the first Mikdash, it doesn't say where the Kruvim are, so he's out of the argument. But between Shemot and Divrei HaYamim there's a apparent problem. And the first generation of the Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael had something to say about it. We don't know who said what, but it's a machloket of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan. One says that they were at an angle. And since they were at an angle, so it depends how you look at it. You could call them face to face, you could call them it depends how you look at it. The other one said that they were that they were moving, that they were on some sort of a and sometimes they were face to face, and sometimes they were not, right? And so, Sha'at Ratzon, and in Yom Kippur, you open the Parochet to see that the Kruvim were face to face, and that's a Sha'at Ratzon. But there were other moments, unfortunately many in our history, where it's not exactly that. And the first, just one second, the first, we go back to enter systems. So the first earliest systems thinking that I'm aware of was written about this in the first part, 8 and 9, of Nefesh HaChaim, which for some of you is a popular work. And Chaim Volozhin says the following. He says, look, I can see the face-to-face, I got that. And then when we're not doing our part, so the female crew should move. But why does the male one move? And he says, it's a system. He says that's the same, I mean, his way of saying is that God doesn't move, but we experience him as moving. That's his way of saying it, but they move together. When you move away, the other person moves away too. That's the system. So now you have a question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This might be because I don't fully understand Buber yet, but I feel like...
You don't fully understand Buber?
But like when
Take your time. It takes about 20 years. It took him 10 years to figure out what he was talking about.
When you're in a room with a client, of course there are those moments where you really feel like you feel the other person, which I think is what an I moment is.
Right. Well, for example, let's say that your client. There was a question that somebody wrote on the blog. I'm afraid I don't always remember who, about what happens if I'm reaching out and the other person isn't answering, right? What I wrote this morning when I saw that was that, it's an invitation. In other words, if I take it upon myself to become the I of I thou, it's not a neutral moment, even if it's not responded to immediately. It may come later. Why? Or other people said, if it's a moment that actually shuffles the deck, so why go back for it, right? Because it's something that human beings experience as whole experience. In other words, the point of I and thou is that a human being is full and whole when they're in the I thou mode, and outside of that, they feel less whole. But they take a risk to become more whole because become more whole by myself. I need to become more whole with another person, which is not the Western way of looking at it, which is if I just perfect my pupik and have enough insight, I will be whole. That's not Buber. And actually, it's not anybody these days. Human beings become whole in connection with each other. So if you invite somebody to it, it may happen a few months later, but the invitation is not experienced. Or you could say the mirror neuron goes off. You know, that something is happening that could happen, even if it isn't happening yet. Did I go off track, or did I give you an answer?
No, I wanted to ask, like, there are those moments, but I still feel that even when you're not having much an IU moment, you could still be very present and still be holding the client, and I don't know if I would use that picture, as in I still think that you're very much face to face.
Right.
I don't see it as a turn, as in even when you're not having an IU moment, you could still be face to face.
Okay, so what Miriam is saying is that Buber was a little bit extreme, indeed. In other words, because the news, you know, the Let's Denies in the book, people have a focus on what they've seen that other people hadn't seen, or they hadn't seen yet. So the book is about the IU moments, and everything else is IU. Is that really our experience is? Not exactly, right? Not exactly. And so you take the book, and when you really understand the book, that's when you say, it's not precise. If I take it into my life, if I take it into my work, I see that it gives me an extraordinary and important insight, but not the final answers, not everything. You won't find the final answer in any human writing, right? But you'll find different things that can help you to understand and give privilege to something. But then you don't want to say, wait a minute, now I have to force my experience into the book? Don't do that. That's why Buber said, this is my experience. You figure your experience. Yeah.
Are you able to give like a few practical examples like how this is example like in the therapy, like how that plays out?
A practical example. You asked that in the blog, right? Or somebody else did. Right.
I would have.
Right. Everybody meant to, but a practical example might be where this is the one I wrote. You can see if it fits for you. Let's say a mother and a daughter are talking about. Let's say she's 16. So the mother wants to be a mother who is a mother for a 16-year-old, not a 15-year-old, and not a 17-year-old. How is she going to do that with the 16-year-old? She can't do it by herself. It isn't upstairs. It's for this 16-year-old. So they're talking about, let's say, about the girl's relationship to her teacher. And the girl is saying something about she doesn't like to be told how to think. And the mother is thinking, maybe I am telling her how to think. And so she turns to her and says, what about you and me? Right? And then there's a moment. And that moment may be silent. It's likely to be, how long? At least 4 seconds, right? Don't zing by it, right? And in that moment, the two of them are coming to a meeting about who tells who how to think, you know, how are we different? And then they continue to talk about it, right? And continuing to talk about it, you know, is content. It's not exactly that co-creational moment, but it's a continuation of it. And it may lead to further meetings like that, but it's not the moment itself. Does that give you, people here have 16-year-old daughters? Does that give you a feeling for what we're talking about?
So what was the moment of like we thinking the same thing and like?
We're not thinking the same thing. We're not thinking at all. See, the Ida moment is not a moment of thinking. It's a moment of presence where something happens between two people. That then.
Back to the idea of that part I was getting was
Yeah.
more like the part that you were saying before of like the whole other you were talking about. You know, we're like mirroring.
What?
Mirroring? Yeah, the mirroring.
The mirroring? Oh,
An example.
where did the mirroring come in that?
Yeah.
Probably when the mother saw something on the daughter's face and experienced it on her own face as well. But that was silent. In other words, something gets communicated. That's like we call an entry point. It brings you to the closeness that allows for the I thou. It's not the whole experience, but it's a basis for it. Now, this is science fiction, just so you know. No one's ever shown this, but the way of thinking. Huh?
Let's say a client makes a statement and then it makes us think something or it triggers a thought, so.
Okay, so you're talking to this woman. You're
You're
talking to this woman, and she's talking about the fact that her 16-year-old daughter is driving her crazy, right? And you see something on her face that resonates on your face, right? And then you have a moment where two mothers are communicating something between them about each other, right? Because maybe she's driving you crazy the way the girl is driving her crazy, or maybe you're driving her crazy. In other words, something is now happening between us. But it happens. And then you can try to figure out what happened. But something happens that's, that hadn't happened before. And it's not a long, it's not, not 45 minutes.
What if I don't have a 16-year-old daughter and nothing bothers me, I just see that it bothers her, and then I pick up on that cue? Is that the same
It depends on how you experience it.
experience?
Yeah, it depends how you experience it. Insight is a marvelous thing. Good chaps in therapy where you say something meaningful or wonderful, it's not all of it. That's what we're adding here. And the reason we're adding it is because in family therapy, you're going to have the mother and the daughter there together, right? And so you're going to try to create a moment where they can stop and have something happen between them. That's a whole other story. One last question, and then I want to begin at least what we're going to do today. Yeah.
I translated Buber as like the I thou being like an existential experience. Is that necessarily, does it not necessarily need to be that deep?
Well, Buber and existentialism. You get called Avital or Esther?
Esther Avital.
Esther Avital. Because Esther Avital says, should we add the word existential experience to Buber? Probably. The word experience has, Buber used two different words for experience in German. One is the usual experience that means that, you experience the room or the weather or whatever. And the other is what's called the lived experience. That's in German, that's Erlebnis. Erfahrung and Erlebnis tended to be the same. Buber separated them. And for Buber, the idea is that it's a deep lived experience. Whether you would use the word existential or not, that depends on where you would use the word existential. But it's not only an experience. See, the point that Buber is trying to say is, if you only think about your experiences, you're only about yourself. There's a different mode of existing. I thou is a different mode of existing. You do something different in I and thou. And the issue is not the experience, it's the doing. It's a co-creating. Okay, now let me just go on here. And we are now going to enter into the field of family therapy. Now, English readers have a distinct advantage because Lynn Hoffman, who was there when family therapy was created, wrote a book about how it all started. Everything that's in the book about how it all started is still going on now. This is not an old book. It's sort of like a timeless book. It's very, very well written. It's not easy. I'll pass it around. Most of what we're going to be reading for the rest of the course, a great deal of it comes from that book. Those who want to find it used on Amazon and see it as a textbook and just read the whole thing, put it this way, you want to be a family therapist, you will be a much deeper family therapist for reading that book. It's not exactly the textbook because I'm not going to tell you what's in the book. I'm going to tell you stuff aside the book. The other textbook is the Family Crucible, which is a whole other story, and that you should be reading along as a book, but also for each session from now on, there's a chapter that's relevant to what we're going to be talking about. Basically we're dealing, if you want, with a three-ring circus. There's Whitaker, Napier and Whitaker, the Family Crucible. It's one way of reading things. There's Lynn Hoffman, which is another way of reading things. And there's what goes on here, which is another way of reading things. And that's good. We're not giving you an answer, we're giving you things to think about. Great. We have to close the door.
I just got a book called Doing Family Therapy by Salvador Minuchin. Is that similar to this?
We're going to get to Minuchin. Yeah.
No, I'm saying,
But-
would that cover, like,
No.
is it a similar thing? It's not a similar.
No, Minution, we'll get to Minution, that'll be the last lecture of this semester. We'll get to Minution. Minution is not all of family therapy. It's the easiest entry port into family therapy. In Israel, it was like the beginning and the end. And that, I think we can do better than. But Minution is an important player, but only for one part of family therapy. And so here is chapter, I think, 11 of Family Crucible. The Bryce family. Have you started to meet the Bryce family with Napier and Whitaker? Napier was a junior therapist, and he also was in therapy with Whitaker. Family therapy started rather incestuous. Everybody was into everybody else's business. But Napier was also a poet, so he knew how to write. Whitaker was this, genius who couldn't write anything clearly. So Napier put the book together. The Bryce family did not have an affair, so we have to go to John and Eleanor to the chapter about extramarital relations. And here I want to begin to sketch something for you, which we're going to work on now between the sessions, and we're going to work on again. So fasten your seatbelts. And this is a couple. Now, John had an alcoholic mother, and when he was 10, his rather cold father divorced from his alcoholic mother. And alcoholic mothers tend to engulf their children. They engage them. They say, look, you have to take care of me. This is what you have to do. And so John's basic experience is one of engulfment. In other words, he's afraid that he's going to get swallowed up by his close partners. And then, so he marries Eleanor, and Eleanor comes from a family where there was much less connection. And so her fear is that she's going to be abandoned. Those are complementary fears. A great many times people find the complementary fear in their spouse. And that's what John and Eleanor did. And then, you see, we have a very simple sentence. It's a linear sentence, as an arrow. Now, as you know, in family therapy, we see arrows, but we also see circles. And what we're going to try to do today is to understand how to turn an arrow into a circle. Because both of them say to the therapist, Eleanor says, every time I ask him to pay attention to me, he runs away. And John says, she keeps bugging me to pay attention, so naturally I move away. It's the same sentence. It's a little different ethical salt, but it's the same sentence. And they say, the two of them, it keeps happening. And then she comes back for more, and I run away. And she comes back for more, and I run away. So how can a linear statement keep happening, right? Something keeps happening has something else going on, which we're not seeing. So now, if we take this sentence, Eleanor turns to John, and John runs away. And we know that Eleanor is afraid of being abandoned, John is afraid of being engulfed, so we can take the external statement. All of the couples that come to you will come with a sentence like that. I want to talk to him about the kids, and he's too busy. And then I want to talk about the kids, and he's too busy. And then I want to talk about the kids, and he's too busy. But it'll be an external statement. So we want to open it up and say, okay, when Eleanor turns to John, what is going on in Eleanor? It's not really an arrow, but what is she expressing? What does she want? What's her internal state? There's Eleanor. She's saying, pay attention to me, but what else is what's she feeling? What makes her do that? And when John rejects Eleanor, what is it going on in him that makes him reject Eleanor, right? So we're taking two linear experiences. I ask him for attention, he runs away, and we're turning it into a feeling, right? A feeling, what am I feeling that makes me turn to him? And what is he feeling that makes him turn away, okay? So then we fill those in, and that's not so hard to fill in, that when Eleanor turns to John, she's trying not to be rejected. She's trying not to be abandoned. That's why she turns to him, right? And the arrow is not precise here, but it means that that's what she's feeling. And John, why does he reject Eleanor? Because he feels engulfed, right? That's so far pretty simple, right? You've all seen couples or will see couples, and that's a simple matter. Now let's have a look. If we move this one over here, you see, we said Eleanor turns to John, and as she turns to him, she's feeling not rejected. And at the same time, when she's feeling not rejected, he is feeling engulfed. See, we just took John and his feelings and put them at the same time, simultaneously. When Eleanor is feeling not rejected, John is feeling engulfed. And so then John rejects Eleanor. Now, if that's the case, then let's have another look here. We have a simultaneous situation. One is okay and one is not okay. But Eleanor is feeling hopeful that she's not rejected, and John is feeling bad, right? So now, after he rejects Eleanor, what happens? Well, when he rejects Eleanor, he's taking care of his engulfment. Now he's not feeling engulfed. And what is Eleanor feeling? Abandoned, right? So this wasn't included in the linear statement. The linear statement was she turns to John and John rejects her. But now we've created something that looks more like a circle, that there was a situation in which when she feels less abandoned, he feels more engulfed, and then he does something, and then the situation switches. It's not just that he feels not engulfed, she feels abandoned. So the two switch. So far we're okay? Now this doesn't sound like I and thou, does it? This is what's called a system. And systems are what make people stuck and not able to engage in co-creation, right? In other words, we're now going to learn about systems, but family therapy is essentially a way of disrupting systems, of taking the systems that become automatic and disrupt the possibility of human co-creation and allow people to do something different. So now it looks like this, doesn't it? We had Eleanor being better and John being worse, and we have Eleanor being worse and John being better. And it turns out that what Eleanor does and what John does are actually things they do together. In other words, they balance the situation. When we say, well, Eleanor turns to John, so she's looking for this situation where she'll be okay and he won't be okay. And when John rejects Eleanor, he creates the opposite situation where Eleanor is not okay and he is okay, right? That's the minus and the plus, okay? But this is a different way of looking at it. See, now we're not saying you're doing this and you're doing that, or you're doing this to him and he's doing this to you. We're looking at two complementary situations. That's the system. The complementary situation is one where if one is feeling good, the other is feeling bad, or they flip. Right? Now, you see how by looking at it this way, we're not talking to Eleanor about what are you doing to John or what are you doing to yourself. We're saying how is your system being regulated by this action. Eleanor's turning to John belongs to both of them. And John's rejecting Eleanor belongs to both of them. Because the two of them need to have these two situations separate. What do they gain from having these two situations separate? And what do they lose? They gain the fact that they're never in a minus and minus together, right? Because that would be explosive. That's what happens when she marries somebody who's afraid of being engulfed, and that makes her feel rejected, and it keeps happening over and over again. They have a balance. The two of them created a system, and now they're stuck in the system that they created. What does the system provide? Well, it's not exactly what you would call a stable situation, because neither situation is stable, is it? When he's feeling engulfed, that's not stable. When she's feeling rejected, that's not stable. So what's stable? The cycle is stable. They keep doing it. In other words, they keep balancing, flip-flopping the two situations, And what do they gain from keeping those two situations separate? That you never have an explosion. The explosion happens when John is feeling engulfed while she's feeling abandoned. Then it explodes. Some of you may have experienced that with clients or with your neighbors, right? Where it's unbearable because anything that she does, he becomes more engulfed, and anything she does, she's completely abandoned. So the two of them can't be in the room together. Here, they have a stable relationship, a lousy relationship, a very common lousy relationship. In other words, this is something that limits their ability to do anything except basically being controlled by what they created. So they keep the two minuses separate, right? And that's what you do when you're complementary. Each one has a different one, to keep them separate. But what do they lose? Just for a second, what do they lose?
Meaningful conversation?
They can never be in plus and plus, and I was in a plus and a plus, right? Where he can be not engulfed, and she can be not abandoned. That never happens. They're never happy.
I don't understand how they can both be in minus or opposite.
They can't be both in minus.
Ever.
In the point of a complementary system is to keep the minuses apart. That's what
That's what
they
they've created, but if they didn't create it, how could they reach a situation where they're both in minus?
They're afraid of, in other words, they're afraid that that their relationship cannot bear the two minuses together. When she is feeling abandoned while he is feeling engulfed, they can't do anything at all.
But that can't happen.
Was I?
That can't happen.
Oh, yes, they can.
How?
Well, if it couldn't happen, they wouldn't have to create this whole system to keep them apart. In other words, people are desperately afraid that that could happen, and so they create a safety mechanism.
But how could it happen? I can't remember.
Oh, Eleanor says to John, instead of turning to him and saying, pay attention to me, she says, you are incapable of feelings. And he says to her, you are incapable of tolerating anybody except yourself. You are incapable, you have no feelings, you have only feelings, and you think that I have to have your feelings. End of conversation. Goodbye. Goodbye. There's no relationship. That's what they were afraid of. But now, they chose complementary partners. It's very common because when you're feeling, let's say for Eleanor to be feeling abandoned, she can't find somebody else who also is afraid of being abandoned. They'll just abandon each other. This way, it's possible to create a balance between the two. Razi?
Yeah, if there's a plus and a minus, there can also be explosions, but then it becomes a minus and a minus, right?
Well, we'll get to that when it explodes, but the complementary, everything can happen. Here we're talking about what does happen in a complementary system. This is a way of looking at complementarity. It's not a bad thing or a good thing, it's something that happens a lot. 1 second, I gotta manage time here. I'm just gonna finish this for a moment, and then we're gonna work on it today. We'll work on it between sessions, and hopefully next time around this will become clearer. You have to suffer it a little bit to have it make sense. So they're trapped in a system that they've created. They're trapped.
Every couple has this root system, right? Every couple should, usually has this
So how do
root
you-
that we have to find.
No, not every couple, complementary couples. And it depends, but let's just pay attention to one last thing, which is what could help them to break a complementary cycle? How can they meet each other if they're always balancing by running away or running to and fro? How could they meet each other? In therapy, what you would do is to say, when Eleanor turns to John, and we've said she turns to John when she's feeling rejected, right? That's when she turns to him. So when you're feeling distant, did you ever feel abandoned before you met John? Because she's saying, you're creating my abandonment. Okay, so let's say that we find out that she can say, my mother, that this precedes John. I have what we could call a deep pit that I fall into, and my pit is when I feel rejected. When I feel rejected, I'm in a deep pit. Oh, that's interesting. Now, let's talk about John. Were there times before you met Eleanor, she keeps swallowing me up. Okay. You apparently know something about being swallowed up. Where does it come from? Okay, so I have this mother who was always swallowing me up. So you had that before, right? It's not because of Eleanor, it's because of you. So each has their own pit, that's the minus, but they're complementary pits. Now, the question is there a way that John can help Eleanor without switching to being engulfed? Can he say, well, you know, let's say that when Eleanor is feeling rejected, that you say to yourself, could I do something to help her to not feel rejected? And the answer is, of course I can do something to help her to not feel rejected. I can feel engulfed, right? That's what we do, right? But then they switch. And so in therapy, they'll keep switching, it keeps coming around, right? But at some point, you say to him, look, how could you feel not engulfed and help Eleanor to feel less rejected? What could you do that would be okay for you and good for her? How could you reach out and say to her, listen, I understand that you're feeling abandoned. It doesn't engulf me. What would make that possible? And we're going to stop with that question and continue next week. You got to suffer. Family therapy. The people who come to you for family therapy are suffering people. Now, why are they suffering here? Because it's too good. It's too stable. It works too well. It takes a tremendous amount of courage and a lot of help to be able to say, maybe we could try and do something that isn't as good as this. This is wonderful.
Why is it wonderful? It's not one of them is always suffering. Either this one or that one. Someone is in a minus all the time.
Create stability.
The both of them are suffering. There's always one who's suffering, but it's stable in the sense that it repeats itself. In other words, it keeps them together. This is the John and Eleanor dance. And they come for therapy and they say, I don't think we can do better. That's what they say to the therapist. I don't think we can do better. And the therapist now has to think about the question that I just asked, to see what could be better than this. This is marvelous. This is so marvelous, it's been running for 20 years, right? And it repeats itself and you say, these are normal people, why can't they get out of it? But this is the relationship.
They wouldn't be coming to therapy.
What?
If it would be marvelous, they wouldn't be coming to therapy. They're not suffering. They're not in pain.
Exactly. Well, that's an interesting question, basically, that we'll get to next time. But why do they come to therapy? And when you start to do therapy, why do they run away? We'll get to that. We're going to break up into groups. The men stay here, and the women go with Dina and Shira upstairs where you were last time. And